Imagine a fortress built of stone and steel that rises from the frozen earth of northern New York like a monument to despair. This is the Clinton Correctional Facility in the village of Dannemora, and for over 170 years, it has held the most dangerous criminals in the state. Locals call it Little Siberia because of the brutal winters that encase the region in ice and snow for months on end. It was designed to be inescapable, and for more than a century, no one had ever breached its maximum security walls and lived to tell the tale. But in the summer of 2015, two men dared to challenge this history. They launched a plan so audacious and complex that it seemed ripped from the pages of a Hollywood script. The village of Dannemora exists in the shadow of the prison walls, which loom over the main street like a constant reminder of the darkness within. Life here revolves around the facility, as generations of families have worked as corrections officers and staff inside the imposing structure. The prison is the economic heart of the community, but it is also a place of strict routine and unyielding discipline. Inside the cell blocks, the air is thick with tension, and the noise of slamming gates echoes through the concrete corridors. It is a world where hope usually goes to die, but for two inmates serving life sentences, the oppressive atmosphere only fueled a desperate desire for freedom. They looked at the walls not as barriers, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. Richard Matt was a career criminal who possessed a charming exterior that masked a violent and manipulative nature. He had a history of escapes and a reputation for being able to acquire anything he wanted inside the prison system. Matt was serving 25 years to life for the kidnapping and brutal murder of his former boss. He was an artist who painted portraits for guards and fellow inmates, using his talent to curry favor and build relationships. His artwork was his currency, and he spent years cultivating a persona of a model prisoner while secretly plotting his next move. He was the mastermind who saw people as pawns on a chessboard, and he knew exactly how to move them to get what he needed. David Sweat was the younger of the two men, and he was serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the murder of a sheriff deputy. Unlike Matt, who relied on charisma and manipulation, Sweat was a disciplined and methodical planner. He was quiet and observant, and he spent his days studying the infrastructure of the prison with the eye of an engineer. Sweat had a keen intellect and a terrifying patience that allowed him to work towards a goal for months or even years without losing focus. While Matt provided the vision and the social connections, Sweat provided the technical expertise and the physical labor required to turn a fantasy into reality. Together, they formed a dangerous partnership born of necessity. The two men were housed in the honor block, which was a privileged section of the prison where inmates who behaved well were granted special freedoms. They were allowed to cook their own meals and visit each other in their cells and stay up late watching television. It was here in this relatively relaxed environment that Matt and Sweat began to bond over their shared hopelessness and their desire to escape. They spent hours whispering in the recreation yard and passing notes between cells as they slowly formulated a plan. They knew that going over the 30-foot walls was suicide, so they decided to go under them. They needed to navigate the labyrinth of tunnels and pipes that ran beneath the prison like a subterranean city. Their opportunity came in the form of the prison tailor shop, where both men worked making uniforms for the state. The shop was a bustling environment filled with the hum of sewing machines and the chatter of civilian supervisors. It was here that they met Joyce Mitchell, who was a 51-year-old industrial training supervisor. Mitchell was married and had a son, but she was unhappy in her life and vulnerable to attention. Richard Matt sensed this vulnerability immediately and began a campaign of seduction and flattery. He painted her portrait and gave her handwritten notes and made her feel special in a way she had not felt in years. It was a cruel manipulation, designed to turn a state employee into an accomplice. Over the course of several months, the relationship between the inmates and Joyce Mitchell crossed the line from professional to personal. Matt and Sweat both engaged in sexual encounters with Mitchell inside the tailor shop, hidden away in storage closets and back rooms. They made her feel like she was part of their world, and they promised her a life of excitement and romance once they were free. They manipulated her emotions until she was completely under their control. She began smuggling contraband into the prison for them, including reading glasses and food, and eventually the tools they would need to break out. Mitchell became their lifeline and their key to the outside world. The plan required tools that could cut through steel and concrete, and Mitchell was the one to provide them. She hid hacksaw blades and drill bits inside frozen hamburger meat that she brought into the prison for the inmates to cook in the honor block. Because she was a trusted employee, the guards at the front gate rarely searched her bags thoroughly. Matt and Sweat received the frozen meat and carefully extracted the tools while keeping their excitement hidden. They now had the means to cut through the back of their steel cells, but they still had to figure out a way to do it without alerting the guards who patrolled the catwalks just a few feet away. The layout of the honor block included a utility corridor that ran behind the cells, which was used for maintenance of the plumbing and electrical systems. Matt and Sweat discovered that if they could cut holes in the back of their cell walls, they could access this corridor and descend into the bowels of the prison. They waited until nightfall when the cell block was quiet and the other inmates were asleep. They used the hacksaw blade to slowly cut through the steel plates at the back of their cells. They worked in shifts with one man cutting, while the other kept watch for the guards. To mask the sound of the sawing, they played music loudly or waited for the noise of the ventilation system to kick in. David Sweat took the lead on the physical labor as he was younger and in better physical shape than Matt. He would squeeze through the hole in his cell wall and crawl into the narrow utility corridor. From there, he began to explore the dark and dusty crawl spaces that led down to the steam tunnels. He found a series of catwalks and ladders that descended deep underground. It was a dangerous and claustrophobic environment filled with asbestos and dirt and the constant hiss of steam pipes. Sweat mapped out a route that would lead them from the cell block to a manhole cover outside the prison walls. It was a journey of hundreds of feet through the industrial gut of the facility. One of the biggest obstacles they faced was a massive brick wall that blocked their path into the main steam pipe system. Sweat spent weeks chipping away at the bricks and mortar with a sledgehammer head he had stolen and a metal punch. He worked in the stifling heat and darkness covered in dust and sweat. Every night he would return to his cell before the morning count and carefully camouflage the hole in his wall with paint and paper mache. He created a removable panel that looked exactly like the original steel plate. The guards who walked past his cell every hour had no idea that just inches away, a tunnel to freedom was being constructed. Once they breached the brick wall, they found themselves facing a large steam pipe that was 24 inches in diameter. This pipe ran under the prison wall and out to the street, which made it their perfect escape route. However, they had to cut their way into it. Using only a hacksaw blade wrapped in a rag for handle, Sweat began the grueling task of cutting through the thick steel of the pipe. It was backbreaking work that took weeks to complete. He had to make 2 cuts to create a removable section of the pipe large enough for a man to crawl through. The sound of the saw on steel was deafening in the confined space, so he had to time his strokes carefully. As the date of the escape approached, the tension between the 2 men began to rise. Richard Matt was becoming increasingly anxious and erratic, while Sweat remained focused and calm. They had arranged for Joyce Mitchell to pick them up in her car once they emerged from the manhole. The The plan was to drive to a cabin in the woods where they could hide out before fleeing to Mexico. They told Mitchell to bring guns and clothes and camping gear. They were counting on her to be their getaway driver, and without her, their plan would fall apart the moment they stepped onto the street. The success of the entire operation hinged on the reliability of a woman who was already showing signs of panic. On the night of June 5, 2015, Richard Matt and David Sweat made their move. They placed dummies they had constructed out of sweatshirts and blankets in their bunks to fool the guards during the night rounds. They arranged the bedding to look like sleeping bodies, rising and falling with breath. Then they slipped through the holes in the back of their cells and entered the utility corridor for the last time. They carried backpacks filled with food and supplies they had hoarded. They climbed down the catwalks and squeezed through the holes they had cut and crawled into the steam pipe. They were now moving through the veins of the prison towards the outside world. The crawl through the steam pipe was a nightmare of heat and claustrophobia. They dragged their bodies over the rough steel surface for hundreds of feet, inhaling dust and rust. The air was thick and hard to breathe. Finally, they reached the section of the pipe where Sweat had cut the exit hole. They pushed the steel plate aside and climbed out into a subterranean junction room. Above them was a manhole cover that led to a street in the village of Dannemora. They climbed the iron rungs of the ladder and pushed against the heavy cover. It shifted and the cool night air rushed in. They were out. Before they left the tunnels, Richard Matt left a note on the steam pipe for the authorities to find. It was a yellow sticky note with a crude drawing of a smiley face, and the words "Have a nice day" written in block letters. It was a final act of arrogance and a taunt to the system he had beaten. He wanted them to know that he had outsmarted them and that he was laughing at their incompetence. This note would become one of the most iconic images of the escape, symbolizing the brazen nature of the crime. It was a message that the chase was on and that Matt and Sweat had a head start. When they emerged from the manhole, they found themselves on a quiet street, just a block away from the prison walls. They scanned the area for Joyce Mitchell's car, but the street was empty. They waited in the shadows, their hearts pounding in their chests. Minutes turned into an hour, and still there was no sign of their accomplice. Joyce Mitchell had suffered a panic attack and had been taken to the hospital instead of driving to the rendezvous point. The two men realized, with a sinking feeling, that they were on their own. Their plan for a quick getaway had evaporated, and they were now fugitives on foot in a hostile environment. The sun rose over Dannemora on June 6th, and the morning roll call at the Clinton Correctional Facility began. Guards walked down the gallery of the honor block checking the cells. When they reached the cells of Matt and Sweat, they saw the shapes under the blankets and assumed the inmates were asleep. It was not until a guard physically shook the bunk that the ruse was discovered. The dummy collapsed and the hole in the wall was revealed. The alarm was sounded and the prison went into immediate lockdown. Sirens wailed across the valley, signaling the first escape from the maximum security facility in its history. The news of the escape sent shockwaves through the state of New York and the entire country. Hundreds of law enforcement officers from the state police and the FBI and the Department of Corrections descended on Dannemora. They set up roadblocks and established a command center and began a massive manhunt. Helicopters patrolled the skies and bloodhounds tracked scents through the woods. The village was transformed into an armed camp as officers in tactical gear searched every house and garage. The governor arrived to tour the escape route and declared the men to be extremely dangerous. The hunt for Matt and Sweat had begun. Investigators quickly zeroed in on the prison staff to determine how the inmates had acquired power tools. Joyce Mitchell was brought in for questioning, and under pressure she cracked. She confessed to her relationship with the inmates and her role in providing the tools. She admitted that she was supposed to be the getaway driver, but had backed out at the last minute. Her confession provided the police with crucial information about the escape plan, but it did not tell them where the men were now. Mitchell was arrested and charged with promoting prison contraband and criminal facilitation. She became the face of the corruption that had allowed the escape to happen. Meanwhile, Matt and Sweat were trekking through the dense forests of the Adirondack Mountains. They moved at night to avoid detection and hid during the day in thick brush and rocky crevices. The terrain was rugged and unforgiving, with steep hills and swamps and swarms of black flies. They were ill-equipped for survival in the wilderness, wearing only prison-issued clothing and carrying limited food. They broke into hunting cabins to steal supplies and alcohol and firearms. They left behind DNA evidence and footprints that allowed the search teams to track their general movement, but they always managed to stay one step ahead. As the days turned into weeks, the physical and mental toll of the escape began to weigh on the men. Richard Matt was older and in poor health, and he began to slow them down. He was drinking heavily from the alcohol they stole, and his blisters were becoming infected. David Sweat grew frustrated with his partner, who was becoming a liability. The disciplined plan they had crafted was falling apart in the chaos of the wild. They argued constantly about their direction and their strategy. The brotherhood that had formed in the cell block was shattering under the pressure of the manhunt. The turning point came when David Sweat decided that he could no longer drag Richard Matt along. Matt was too slow and too loud and too drunk. Sweat knew that if he stayed with him, they would both be caught. In a moment of cold calculation, Sweat made the decision to separate. He left Matt behind in the woods and struck out on his own, moving faster and lighter. He aimed for the Canadian border, hoping to disappear into a new country. Matt was left alone with his demons and a bottle of gin, stumbling through the forest as the circle of law enforcement closed in around him. On June 26, 3 weeks after the escape, a border patrol team was searching a wooded area near Lake Titus. They heard a cough and the sound of movement in the brush. They challenged the suspect and ordered him to show his hands. Richard Matt emerged from the trees, holding a 20-gauge shotgun. He refused to drop the weapon and aimed it towards the officers. A tactical team member fired 3 rounds, striking Matt in the head. The mastermind of the escape fell dead in the dirt, his journey ending in violence, just as his life had been defined by it. The autopsy revealed he was intoxicated and covered in bug bites. With Richard Matt dead, the focus of the manhunt shifted entirely to David Sweat. The police knew he was still out there and likely moving towards the border. The search perimeter was tightened and new resources were poured into the area. Sensors were placed on trails and thermal imaging cameras scanned the woods from the air. Sweat was moving like a ghost, using his knowledge of the terrain to evade capture. He was exhausted and starving, but his will to survive kept him moving. He was now the most wanted man in America, and thousands of eyes were looking for him. 2 days after Matt was killed, a state police sergeant named Jay Cook was on patrol near the town of Constable, just a few miles from the Canadian border. He was driving down a rural road when he saw a man jogging along the tree line. The man was dressed in camouflage clothing and carried a backpack. Sergeant Cook turned his vehicle around, and the man bolted into an open field. Cook recognized him as David Sweat. He exited his vehicle and gave chase, shouting commands for the fugitive to stop. Sweat ignored the orders and sprinted towards the tree line, hoping to vanish into the woods one last time. Sergeant Cook knew that if Sweat made it to the trees, he might never be seen again. He raised his service pistol and fired 2 shots at the fleeing figure. Both bullets struck Sweat in the torso, knocking him to the ground. Cook approached carefully and handcuffed the wounded man. David Sweat looked up at the officer and simply said, "I am David Sweat." The 23-day manhunt was over. He was alive but critically injured. He was airlifted to a hospital in Albany where doctors saved his life so that he could be returned to the very system he had tried so hard to escape. The capture of David Sweat brought a collective sigh of relief to the residents of northern New York, who had lived in fear for 3 weeks. The roadblocks were lifted, and the tactical teams packed up their gear. But the questions remained. How could 2 inmates cut their way out of a maximum security prison without anyone noticing? An investigation by the Inspector General revealed a culture of complacency and corruption at the Clinton Correctional Facility. Security procedures had been ignored, and employee bags were not searched, and inmates were given too much freedom. The escape exposed deep flaws in the management of the prison. Joyce Mitchell pleaded guilty to her role in the escape and was sentenced to up to 7 years in prison. She expressed remorse for her actions, but many saw her as a manipulator who had betrayed her duty. Another prison employee, named Jean Palmer, who had unwittingly helped pass the hamburger meat to the inmates, also faced charges. The warden and several senior executives were forced to retire. The escape led to a massive overhaul of security protocols across the New York State prison system. Nightly inspections of cell integrity became mandatory, and the honor block privileges were severely curtailed. David Sweat recovered from his gunshot wounds and was transferred to a new maximum security prison. He was placed in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. He was sentenced to an additional 3.5 to 7 years for the escape and ordered to pay restitution for the damage to the prison. In interviews with investigators, he detailed the engineering of the breakout with pride, explaining exactly how he had defeated the walls. He seemed to view the escape as his masterpiece, a technical achievement that proved his intelligence even if it ended in failure. The Dannemora prison break remains one of the most fascinating true crime stories of the modern era. It captured the public imagination because it played out like a movie with villains and heroes, and a plot that seemed impossible. It was a story of human ingenuity used for evil and the relentless pursuit of justice. It highlighted the fragility of the systems we rely on to keep us safe and the dangerous charisma of sociopaths like Richard Matt. The image of the smiley face note on the steam pipe serves as a chilling reminder that no wall is high enough to suppress the human desire for freedom, no matter how dangerous the person seeking it may be. Today, the Clinton Correctional Facility still stands imposing and cold against the backdrop of the Adirondack Mountains. The hole in the steam pipe has been welded shut and the bricks have been replaced. But the legend of the escape lives on in the minds of the staff and the inmates. It is a cautionary tale told to new guards and a source of dark inspiration for prisoners who dream of the outside world. The escape proved that even in the most secure places on Earth, there are cracks waiting to be found if one has the time and the will to look for them. The legacy of the Dannemora escape is not just in the reforms it sparked, but in the way it challenged our perception of security. We like to believe that once a criminal is locked away, they are gone from our world. But Matt and Sweat reminded us that they are still there thinking and planning and waiting. The modern Shawshank story was not fiction, but a gritty reality that played out in our own backyard. It forces us to ask what other secrets lie hidden behind the concrete walls of our prisons, and who else is quietly cutting through the steel in the dark. As the sun sets over the village of Dannemora, the lights of the prison buzz to life, illuminating the yard where Richard Matt and David Sweat once walked. The silence of the night is deceptive, masking the constant activity within. The story of their escape is now part of the history of the North Country, a legend of ice and iron. And while the physical scars on the prison have healed, the psychological impact remains. It is a story that will be told for generations, a testament to the lengths men will go to when they have nothing left to lose. In the end, the Dannemora prison break serves as a complex study of human nature. It showcased loyalty and betrayal, intelligence and foolishness, hope and despair. It was a collision of lives that resulted in tragedy and terror. As we look back on those 3 weeks in June of 2015, we are left with the haunting realization that the line between order and chaos is thinner than a steel plate, and all it takes is a hacksaw blade and a little bit of time to cut right through it.